Welcome to another episode of Critic.Reading.Writing. My name is Quayson, and I am Professor of English and Chair of the Department of African and African American Studies at Stanford University. In this episode, we will continue to explore a typology of literary representations of disability that we started a couple of weeks ago. As we noted before, the place of disabled characters in the literary and aesthetic domain is assigned within a structure of relations. Even though generalizations might be possible with respect to representations of people with disability in literature, the literary relations through which they are manifested differ from text to text. The point is that the structure of such literary relations enjoins us to isolate the disabled character for examination only as a preliminary step towards reinserting them into the interrelated thresholds of meanings that are established in their relationship to other characters and to images, motifs, social settings, and to broader ethical concepts that are seen within the literary text. In other words, disability is to be read as a fulcrum or pivot out of which various discursive details emerge, gain salience, and ultimately get transformed within the literary aesthetic field. Sometimes, in the text in which disability is a marker of moral deficit, the impairment is concealed until a particular ethical impasse is arrived at in the text. Here, its use as a signifier of moral deficit is more in terms of a sudden epiphany for the non-disabled character than a slow process of unfoldment about the disabled character's problematic sense of his or her own identity, as we find, say, in the case of Shakespeare's Richard III. This relationship between concealment and epiphany is slightly different from cases where an impairment is mentioned as a mere detail of characterization and then completely forgotten afterwards. In the essay, Any Distinguishing Features, the portrayal of disability in the crime mystery genre, Erving Zola remarks on how rare it is for detectives who use wheelchairs to complain when faced with architectural impediments to their mobility, such as a flight of stairs, for example. Their impairment suddenly vanishes from the account. A good example of the epiphanic use of disability is to be seen in Ralph Ellison's The Invisible Man. Brother Jack, who conscripts the Invisible Man into the Brotherhood, is described from the beginning as a short, insignificant-looking, bushy-eyebrowed man with a quiet smile on his face. The only peculiarity about him is his gait, which is described as a rapid, rolling, bouncy, heel-and-toe step. Brother Jack is, on the whole, a genial man, and there is nothing to raise suspicion about him. After conscripting the narrator, he becomes his defender when other members of the Brotherhood criticize what they see as the backwardness of the Invisible Man's early speech-making. As the narrator becomes more prominent in the Brotherhood, certain hitherto concealed ideological differences begin to emerge between him and the other members of the organization. Matters of overall strategy come to a head after the politicized funeral of a former member of the Brotherhood in Harlem. Whereas Jack and the Brotherhood think that the people are only the seat of mindless passions that need to be scientifically channeled for a proper revolution to take place, the narrator insists that they be accorded the respect due to a highly self-conscious people who, through their experiences of racism and injustice, have a much deeper insight about what is best for them than the Brotherhood imagines. At the special meeting that is called to discuss the question, tempers rise. There is stomping around the table. Voices are raised at cross purposes. And then, suddenly, "Now see here," Brother Jack began, leaping to his feet to lean across the table. And I spun my chair half around on its hind legs as he came between me and the light, gripping the edge of the table, spluttering and lapsing into a foreign language, choking and coughing and shaking his head as I balanced on my toes now, set to propel myself forward. Seeing him above me and the others behind him, as suddenly something seemed to erupt out of his face. "You are seeing things," I thought. Hearing it strike sharply against the table and roll as his arm shot out and snatched an object the size of a large marble and dropped it plop into his glass, and I could see the water shooting up in a ragged, light-breaking pattern to spring in swift droplets across the oiled top table. I stared at the glass, seeing how the light shone through, throwing a transparent, precisely fluted shadow against the dark green of the table. And there, on the bottom of the glass, lay an eye, a glass eye, a buttermilk white eye, distorted by the light rays. An eye staring fixedly at me as from the dark waters of a well. I stared into his face, feeling a sense of outrage. His left eye had collapsed, a line of raw redness showing where the lid refused to close, and his gaze had lost its command. I looked from his face to the glass, thinking, he's disemboweled himself just in order to confound me. The uncanniness of this sudden disembowelment, as the narrator puts it, should not detract from the fact that until this point, there has not been the slightest hint that Brother Jack had a glass eye. Even going back through to carefully trace references to his eyes from the very beginning of his introduction in the novel does not yield any sign of his impairment. There are many references to him wiping his eyes or his face with his hands, or staring intently at his interlocutors, but none of these descriptions betray the fact that there is anything wrong with his eyes. It is only now, at the point when a serious ethical distinction is being drawn between his ideas about class struggle and the narrator's personal experiences among the people, that his disability is suddenly and without prior preparation foisted upon us. The unheimlich, or uncanny nature of this moment is registered in the mind of the narrator in the simultaneous speeding up and slowing down of his perception of the event. Ragged light breaking patterns in swift droplets, fluted shadow against the dark green of the table, and the repetition of the word "I" attached to various metaphors, from buttermilk and white prism distorted by light to an eerie eye staring from out of a well. In this way, the suddenness and unanticipated emergence of the impairment with the multifarious metaphors that attach to it become the means to accentuate the peculiar unusualness of the entire event. The disclosure of the impairment acts much like a discursive punctuation mark, providing a vehicle for the intensification of ethical contradictions made evident at that point in the text. In contrast to The Invisible Man, in Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird, the disability of Tom Robinson, who has been falsely accused of raping a white girl, is concealed from us until the court scene. Told from the perspective of the child narrator Louise Scout Finch, the story progresses strictly as a pattern of discoveries open to her. But disclosure of Tom Robinson's disability turns out to be a multifaceted epiphany both for her and for the reader. The accused man is mentioned many times in the novel ahead of the trial scene, and each time we are given a little bit of information to add to the evolving picture of a hard-working and God-fearing man who is innocent of what he has been accused of. Yet a residual sense of doubt still remains for the narrator because of the insistence with which the rest of the community outside the inner circle of Scout, her brother Jem, and her lawyer father Atticus are convinced of Tom's guilt. As in The Invisible Man, there's a build-up of tension in the immediate lead-up to the disclosure. The tension of the days leading up to the trial is almost unbearable and becomes palpable at the trial itself. Witnesses for the accused are called and questioned, and Tom is the last to be called forward in a long and absolutely riveting courtroom drama. He stands up slowly, and a revelation suddenly takes place. Tom Robinson's powerful shoulders rippled under his thin shirt. He rose to his feet and stood with his right hand on the back of the chair. He looked oddly off balance, but it was not from the way he was standing. His left arm was fully 12 inches shorter than his right and hung dead at his side. It ended in a small shriveled hand, and from as far away as the balcony I could see that it was no use to him. Thomas Robinson reached around, ran his fingers under his left arm, and lifted it. He guided his arm to the Bible, and his rubber-like left hand sought contact with the black binding. As he raised his right hand, the useless one slipped off the Bible and hit the clerk's table. He was trying again when Judge Taylor growled, "That'll do, Tom." Tom took the oath and stepped into the witness chair. Unlike what we saw with Brother Jack, here the sudden disclosure of the disability is meant not to raise doubts about the moral stature of the disabled person, but to dispel them. When the jury, in spite of all the evidence that has been presented in court, return a unanimous verdict of guilty, we sense with Louise Finch and her brother Jem that a major rupture has taken place in their view of the world. The black Tom Robinson's withered arm joins the list of other disabilities we find in the novel, those of Calpurnia, Boo Radley, and Mr. Dolphus Raymond, to define the need for a cautious withholding of judgment in the evaluation of different characters. For it is not only Tom who is a victim of prejudice. Prejudice is the product of a tribal desire to demarcate between inside and outside, between what is acceptable behavior and what is not, and thus cuts across the understandings of race, class, and gender amongst the people of Maycomb in the novel. We may usefully name this category of disability as the representation of disability as epiphany. We shall have more to say on this in an upcoming episode when we come to examine characters in Toni Morrison's novels such as The Bluest Eye, Sula, Beloved, and Paradise. The next major category of disability representation I want to highlight is that in which the disabled character is taken as a signifier of sacred or ritual processes. Examples abound in Greek literature and include figures such as Sophocles' Oedipus and Philoctetes, both of whom have limbs, and his Ajax, as well as Euripides' Agave in the Bacchae, both of whom suffer bouts of madness, among many other characters. In the cases of both Oedipus and Philoctetes, their disability is salient only after they have committed a transgression that is considered to be polluting to the community. In Oedipus' case, it is the inadvertent killing of his father and the unwitting marriage to his mother. Whereas with Philoctetes, his pollution comes from inadvertently stepping on the sacrificial snake and by that profaning the holy sacrifice the Greeks were performing on their way to the Trojan War. In both cases, their transgressions are considered as marking them with ritual danger, so that they must be driven out from the community to avoid the total destruction of the rest of the people. At the same time, there's also a desire by the wider society to acquire or at least gain access to a boon that these disabled characters possess, and which is seen as critical for the well-being of the rest of the community. This is to be noted in the two cases we have just mentioned, in the temporality of the schema that defines their shift from innocence to ritual transgression to contagion and then to sacredness. Thus, in the case of Oedipus, it is only in Oedipus at Colonus, a play that places him at a stage many years after his banishment from Thebes, that we find the Thebans and the Athenians appealing to him for his blessing. In Philoctetes, on the other hand, the eponymous hero is first condemned to exile on the island of Lemnos, and only later, after about 9 years, is sought out by Odysseus and the Greek army to try and gain possession of the magic bow and arrows that had been bequeathed to him by Heracles. The entire encounter between Neoptolemus, son of Achilles, who is tasked with tricking him out of the bow, and the anguished and homesick Philoctetes, is that between conscience and pain, between the call of duty and the bearing of witness to the melancholy of indescribable loss of bodily integrity and of homeland. In other traditions, such as those of the Yoruba of West Africa, Eshu, the limping trickster god of crossroads, is not seen to carry any such ritual contagion. His ritual role is quite different. As the trickster god, he represents a trial of human perception, confounding what seems self-evident in order to establish the need for humility in the face of the ultimate inexplicableness of the human life world. In Robert Farris Thompson's Flash of the Spirit, African and Afro-American Art and Philosophy, he suggests that the spirit of improvisation encapsulated by Eshu is central to African American music and is a legacy of the improvisational performance qualities of the god that the slaves brought with them from Africa. On the other hand, Henry Louis Gates Jr. suggests in Signifying Monkey that a direct line may be traced between the signifying monkey of African American folklore and the Yoruba Eshu. Eshu's limp is thus the paradigm of access to multiple realities of both the real world and that of the gods. He represents a disabled character god who provides superior insights into the phenomenal world, and in this he may be likened to similar characters from Greek myths such as Hephaestus, Tiresias, and Cassandra. Coupled with the proliferation of Eshu Elegbara cults in the New World, such as in Brazil and in Cuba, it is clear that the limping god of the Yorubas is interpreted as having a transhistorical and modern significance that goes beyond any ritual position exclusively assigned to him among the Yoruba. This class of disability representation may be termed disability as ritual signifier. The blind and hermaphrodite Tiresias is well known in Western culture from his roles in both Sophocles' Oedipus Rex and Euripides' The Bacchae. What is often not noted is the degree to which characters such as Cassandra and Io, both afflicted by mental disorders through the Olympian god's capriciousness, become conduits for the sense of tragic ethos that saturates the world in which they find themselves. Cassandra, a prophetess cursed by Apollo to bear the gift of prophecy, yet never to be believed, foretells her own death to people who stand utterly in doubt about what she is prophesying to them. That is the poignant picture we get in Aeschylus' Agamemnon. When Cassandra tells the Argive chorus of old men about the impending murder of Agamemnon that is taking place as they speak, she also serves notice of her peculiar ability to capture and express in her very own person the tragic ethos of the unfolding action. A similar observation can be made about Io, who, transformed into a cow by Hera for Zeus's amorous interest in her, acts as a counterpoint to Prometheus in Aeschylus' Prometheus Bound. Even though Io lacks the prophetic insight of Cassandra, her wails as the gadfly stings her represents the saturation point of this tragic ethos. For unlike Prometheus, the trajectory of whose defiant response to Zeus's punishment makes him decidedly epic rather than tragic, Io is bereft of any such grandeur, and yet bears a burden of tragic knowledge that must nonetheless remain inarticulable. That is the meaning of her wailing. Read in this way, we might term the Cassandra-Io complex of disability, that is to say, insight coupled to disarticulation, that is to be found repeated in female figures as different as Shakespeare's Ophelia, Brecht's Catherine, and Toni Morrison's Baby Suggs, among various others, as instances of the recognition of the tragic ethos by the disabled female characters. This coincides precisely with their inability to speak of their terrible, tragic knowledge. All that is left is a series of fragmented enactments of the self, posing an enigma for the characters around them, as well as for the reader and spectator. This form of disability representation is a counterpoint to the more common one in which disabled characters are shown as bearers of superior insight. We shall term this class of disability as disability in the form of enigmatic, tragic insight. Closely connected to the representation of disability as enigmatic, tragic insight, but in a much more elusive register, are cases where the disability, whether physical or cognitive, is considered the site of a major hermeneutical impasse. The lack of closure implied in this kind of representation may also have ethical implications, yet it is the problem of interpretation that remains paramount. Thus, in Vladimir Nabokov's short story Signs and Symbols, the young suicidal patient's strange mental symptoms, shown in the impulse to interpret the natural world as harboring something directly pertinent to his being, are termed by a scholar as a form of referential mania, thus providing a key both to the patient's illness and to the process of inference that is installed at the heart of the story. Referential mania is also pertinent to the interpretation of the mental illness of Virginia Woolf's Septimus Warren Smith in Mrs. Dalloway, where he too believes that all of London's trees and birds are trying to tell him something. And yet, referential mania is exactly what it is, a manic urge to interpret, provoked by a heightened consciousness that nevertheless does not lead to any direct enlightenment. In such cases, it is the process of an open-ended interpretation that is made salient, as opposed to any disclosure of meaning as such. This category we shall term disability as hermeneutical impasse. The final category that we should bear in mind is the one in which the disabled characters are completely normalized and exist within the full range of human emotions, contradictions, hopes, fears, and vague ideas, just like any other characters. The life writing of disabled people themselves has ensured an increasing number of such accounts, but such complex accountings are not solely from the pens of disabled people. One difficulty with ascertaining the range of text in this category is that if a writer does not declare himself or herself to carry an impairment, it becomes almost impossible to detect signs of disability from their writing. However, there is a counter-argument to the one I have just made here. In Helen Deutsch's Resemblance and Disgrace, Alexander Pope and the Deformation of Culture, she argues that the impairments carried by writers such as Alexander Pope, Lord Byron, and Samuel Johnson, among others, gives a particular quality and texture to their works, something which has long been denied by mainstream scholars. Also, and quite often, when disability is being represented as part of normality, it is also being used as a pointed critique of social hypocrisy and indeed of social institutions as such. This may be seen either in the depiction of the crisis of the individual, such as in Flaubert's Madame Bovary, in D.H. Lawrence's Lady Chatterley's Lover, John Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men, and W. Somerset Maugham's Of Human Bondage, or in terms of a critique of the entire carceral economy of prisons and hospitals, to be found in Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain or Ken Kesey's One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. This final set we shall refer to as disability as normality plus social critique. Thank you. Please remember to check out the suggested readings in the episode's description. And if you like this episode, give a thumbs up, subscribe and share. Hit the notifications bell so that you do not miss out on any upcoming episodes. and enter your comments in the section below. See you next week.